Hello and welcome to Varnblog. And today we're actually doing an article that is more purely philosophical than even, let's say, theoretical. I am reading from a blog post from about 10 years ago, and I actually noticed that about 10 years ago is when the change in the algorithms of social media really discouraged blogging. Um, And it's kind of a shame because there was a lot of good introductory work that would never make it into like an academic paper, but that came with the wrestling of ideas that was in the blogging world about a decade ago. Some of that has cut over in the TikTok world, but the executive function damage is hard to undo. So I do lament those times. And that's the end of the old man moment for today. Let's get into this piece. Hegel's Unhappy Consciousness by Jonathan Allen. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness a consciousness that experiences itself divided within and against itself. Arising from the skeptical consciousness, the unhappy consciousness is aware of its duality of master and servant and aims to find a conception which reconciles the two. The unhappy consciousness can be divided as being two persons in one. It fluctuates between identifying with one or the other and experiences a tension between the infinite and finite aspects of the self. Asterisk. And we're going to have to talk about infinite aspects of the self. That's an element in Hegel's thought that you won't find in Marx. And while a lot of people think the master-servant dialectic is part of Marx, it's not really ever mentioned anywhere because it's part of Hegel's phenomenology, not really a description of social relations. All right. This unstable condition is inherited from the skeptical consciousness, as it regards itself as being essentially godlike, but also realizes that it's very far from such a condition. It is the feeling of which you know all there is to know, but also knowing that you don't know and can't know all there is to know. And in fact, it would indeed be impossible. After giving an exposition of Hegel's unhappy consciousness, I will put forward the critiques by Philip J. Kane and Howard P. Kahns to address some of the problems that arise with the unhappy consciousness and to examine how this notion connects with other philosophers. Hegel breaks his notion of the unhappy consciousness down into three stages. The first outlines the universal master and the individual servant, and they are opposed. This is analogous to the idea of the otherworldly God and the earthly human. One relationship to God's otherworldliness is feeling-based, and it is through religious devotion directed towards the infinite being that the relationship is made. And this is why I talk about why you really do need to know theology to get into what Hegel's on about, even in the phenomenology, and definitely in the logic, because there are some assumptions about human self in there that does require you to have a theological conception of what the human is. The second stage of the unhappy consciousness has a universal and individual partly identified by being brought closer together. The two are reconciled to an extent that the servant aspect begins to conceive of the master aspect as having some distinct individuality. God is brought down to earth and takes the form of the individual person, such as Jesus, a king or an emperor, a physical object or a place, or even the earth itself. The servant then tries to become one with the individual aspect of God by worshiping this individual object, place, or earthly thing. If the earth is conceived as God's body, then the servant works with nature in order to get closer to God. As the unhappy consciousness as servant attempts to become one with God by working with nature, the earthly manifestation of God, it surrenders its independence to it. Likewise, God's manifestation surrenders itself for the benefit of the servant, and so the two are unified to some extent. However, there are some frustrations that arise in this situation. The servant surrenders all of itself, whereas God only gives an infinitesimal bit. Secondly, if the servant feels proud or satisfied from their devotion, they are not in fact being selfless and surrendering. If the manifestation is a religious relic, owing it does not necessarily take one or more spiritual or closer to God, since it has no consciousness and is merely an abstract object. The unhappy consciousness, now totally frustrated with its futile efforts, retreats from identifying with either of its aspects and regards itself as constantly fluctuating between the two, identifies with the point of nothingness between the two inner aspects. It reaches a nihilistic meaninglessness. Frustrated with the earthly work to achieve unity with God, the unhappy conscious realizes the full impact of its individuality and the distance it creates in relation to God. This causes the unhappy consciousness to completely despise its own existence. Hegel points out that this extreme negation of individual existence, i.e., asceticism, operates against the background of an awareness of God. The unhappy consciousness now considers itself to be an explicit nothingness, which stands as a mere fluctuation between two aspects of itself. The explicit awareness of itself is neither fully God nor fully individual, generating a triadic relationship with the unhappy consciousness. The former servant aspect is regarded as a pure object, the master aspect is regarded as an absolute truth, and the unhappy consciousness takes itself to the point in transition between the two. The unhappy consciousness now sees itself as meaningless mediator between two aspects of the self, neither of which can be regarded as completely itself. You can think about this in Freud, for example, with the id, the ego, and the superego. The ego can take a nihilistic role as a mediator. This causes the unhappy consciousness to seek an external mediator, such as a priest or some other person. By completely submitting itself to a priest, the unhappy consciousness reduces itself to an object or a thing like consciousness. It surrenders its autonomy, property, and body. There is a turnaround with the servant's consciousness, and there's a point with identification with the priest. As it obeys the priest's commands, it embodies the priest's will and thus becomes more like the priest itself. Eventually, the unhappy consciousness internalizes the external priest and realizes that it has been the priest within itself and reaches a point where it reconciles to opposing aspects of belief. Again, think about Freud's self-integration for what this means in secular terms. But just remember, Hegel doesn't mean it just in secular terms. He also means it in religious ones. This third stage of the unhappy consciousness has a transition to reason, which is possible when the individual and the universal are finally identified and reconciled. The tension between the individual and particular, this is where I'm talking, remains there, but it becomes possible to hold the two in tension, and a third thing sublates into existence. See the dialectics ductwork here? Hegel refers to this condition as the dawning of reason, of the certainty that its particular individuality, it has an absolute in itself, or is all reality. In other words, Hegel seeks to bridge the in itself for itself distinction with this third category arising from the unhappy or negative consciousness. It is an idealistic view of the world which acknowledges the independent existence of the natural world from any particular thinking individual. Although Hegel's treatment of the uncatching consciousness alludes to Christianity, Philip C. Kane argues that it also alludes to a section of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Practical Reason that deals with the postulates of pure practical reason. For Kant, the highest good requires the reconciliation of virtue and happiness. Kane points out what this entails according to Kant. Quote, happiness, Kant thinks, requires the regular satisfaction of our needs, interests, and desires. But to be virtuous, we certainly cannot be determined by needs, interests, or desires. We must be determined by the moral law. And if we lived in one world, then there would be no longer to expect virtue and happiness to be reconcilable. Only if there are two worlds can we imagine such a reconciliation. And if we postulate, that is, Hegel and will insist, only if we construct a God who will see it that nature is ordered such while we act virtuously, our desires will at the same time be satisfied, so that we can also be happy. Kant's discussion of the highest good is comparable to that of the Stoics and the Epicureans. Kant suggests that this influences Hegel's discussion of Stoicism leading up to the unhappy consciousness. However, he points out that Kant does not mention skepticism, and Hegel does not refer to Epicureanism. Kant argues that both the Stoics and the Epicureans mistakenly identified virtue and happiness, as Kant explains. The Stoics held that virtue was itself the highest good, and they understood happiness as merely the consciousness of the possession of virtue. Epicureanism, on the other hand, held that furthering one's unhappiness was virtue. It held that happiness was the highest good, and that virtue was simply a means to achieve it. Kant does not accept these conceptions of virtue and happiness and regards them as being distinct, each belonging to a separate world, and thinks that God is required to reconcile them. Kant draws the connection between parts of Kant's philosophy, Hegel's unhappy consciousness. Kant thinks that what Hegel has in mind in the first stage of the unhappy consciousness is Kant's notion of holiness, which implies complete agreement with the will with the moral law. Kant claims that we should strive for this perfection, although he admits that it is impossible for anyone to attain. The Stoic position assumes virtuosity and holiness would satisfy our desires and thus make us happy. However, for Kant, this is only an ideal and we must only seek virtue. Kant suggests that this is echoed in the first stages of the unhappy consciousness, where the individual attempts to reconcile the unchangeable, infinite, universal, and to overcome unhappiness. This is attempted through devotion, purity of heart, and purity of thought. The second stage of the unhappy consciousness finds devotion is not enough and thus adopts a second strategy of work and desire. Kant suggests that this echoes Kant's discussion of Epicureanism, where he argues that Epicurus identified virtue with happiness. For Epicurus, fostering one's happiness is a virtue, and happiness is the highest good, with virtue being a means to attain it. However, Kant rejects Epicureanism entirely as he believes that virtue and happiness are different things, that they belong to two very different realms and require God to reconcile them. Kant points out that Hegel fundamentally disagrees with Kant's conception of happiness and cannot accept the notion that it is incompatible with virtue. Kant's ideas of happiness involve the satisfaction of inclinations, desires, and needs, and so on, whereas Hegel's conception is more like Aristotle's, and Kant expresses this succinctly. Quote, virtue is to be sought as an end in itself, but also as a means to happiness. Happiness is understood as satisfaction that arises out of activities that are virtuous and that are excellently performed. Hegel disagrees with the Kantian unhappy consciousness since it does not acknowledge that desire and work can be satisfying and enjoyable. Furthermore, we do not need God to reconcile virtue and happiness for us. It is strange to assume that we are not responsible for reconciling happiness with virtue. Kant misunderstands virtue and happiness since he assigns each to a different realm, so that virtuous activity will not get us happiness and that we require God to reconcile them. According to Hegel, such a God is a construction to solve a problem we should not have caused in the first place. As mentioned above, in the exposition of Hegel's unhappy consciousness, the external mediator is thought to be the priest of the church. Kant suggests that Hegel also wants to allude to Kant's mediator, the God that reconciles virtue and happiness. An objection to Kant's suggestion about the eternal mediator being reconciling God is that Hegel's mediator is the middle term between the individual consciousness and the universal, unchangeable being. The mediator would have to be the church, which mediates between the individual and God, rather than God who mediates between virtue and happiness. Kant points out that Hegel also says, quote, the middle term is itself a conscious being, the mediator, which does make it sound like the mediator is God. What the mediator mediates is consciousness. Kant goes on to say that the three terms individual consciousness, the mediator, and the unchangeable are constructions within self-consciousness, and says that self-consciousness from the start has constructed two worlds. He expresses this as a problem. Quote, the whole problem results from the fact that consciousness posits two worlds and now must bridge them. And it is self-consciousness that does the bridging. For Hegel, this is to solve a false problem with the unnecessary solution, except without seeing it for what it is doing. And if it saw what it is doing, it could not accept it. Self-consciousness is constructing itself as absolute consciousness, which is to say God or the absolute, properly understood in Hegel's view as beginning to emerge here. And this element of emergence is part of the Hegelian Marxist worldview too, even though all the theology and metaphysical assumptions are stripped out. Furthermore, Kane claims that Hegel's views about consciousness bear a similarity to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the superhuman. In order to avoid the emptiness of nihilism, the superhuman must construct a value and meaning, otherwise none would exist. The superhuman has to create an illusion. He points out that for Hegel too, consciousness faces an empty void of skepticism without any objective reality. It must construct its own God if it was to have any reality. Overall, Kane's argument on the issue suggests that Hegel undermines the Kantian difference between the theoretical and practical reason. Kant's commitment to the two worlds caused a tension between these two forms of consciousness, since each was regarded as belonging in a separate world, which must be reconciled with God. Kane explains the difference. Theoretical reason constructs a phenomenal world of experience. Practical reason, on the other hand, has a special relationship to the noumenal sphere. For Kant, we cannot say that the practical reason constructs the noumenal sphere. Practical reason is extremely modest. It denies that it constructs anything. The noumenal, the thing in itself, reality, are all unknowns for it. Practical reason simply benefits from the noumenal. For the practical reason, the noumenal is a source of freedom, morality, the categorical imperative, the highest good. Practical reason dutifully serves the noumenal. It does not construct it. In other words, Kane claims that the theoretical reason is just as rash as practical reason is modest. Hegel regards the idea of two worlds as a mere construction that is not plausible. Without these two worlds, the Kantian practical reason cannot be sustained, as there would be no second noumenal world for practical reason to draw upon, serve, and respect. I agree with Kane's point here and think that it is problematic that Kant conceived of the two worlds and claims that only God can reconcile virtue and happiness. I take a stand much like Nietzsche would on the issue and regard the absolute, the otherworldly, as an unhealthy and unfulfilling way of conceiving the world. Soren Kierkegaard's essay, The Unhappiest Man, interprets Hegel's unhappy consciousness as a situation in which the essence of a self-conscious individual is no longer present to him, but in some matter outside him, such as the individual manifests as a dichotomy of temporal alienation. Such a situation develops when a person lives in the past or in the future without being reconciled to the present self, their present essence. Howard P. Keynes points out that in Sickness Unto Death, he examines many other senses in which the individual may fail to be reconciled with his own eternal essence, and thus enters various states of despair. This theme of despair appears in Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, where the once devout believer comes to reject their otherworldly beliefs and kills God in the sense of rejecting him as a foundation for belief. Thus, there is a nihilistic despair, where once devout believer has lost a father figure and must overcome this in a terrible state by adopting life-affirming interpretations of the world and one's own existence. This doesn't sound like Lacanian psychoanalysis. I don't know what does. That's why I'm talking. Secondly, Kierkegaard's notion of misplaced perspective, one not being reconciled with their present self or essence, is echoed in Nietzsche's Death of God, where the belief in an otherworldly God creates a kind of social sickness, along with the profound unhappiness and dissatisfaction. What the unhappy consciousness and death of God have in common is in the theme of projecting oneself onto an otherworldly other. However, this theme is treated differently by their respective philosophers. Hegel aims to reconcile with the other, big O, whereas Nietzsche claims that it is dead, illusionary, and unhealthy to believe in. Kane points out that psychological transcendence is a satyriac practice that is redolent of Hegel's analysis of the second stage of the unhappy consciousness. Definite quote. In the cases where people are no longer able to protect the image of the divinity and were in danger of dispersion of psychic energy, the ambiguous situation was often alleviated by a dream or a vision of the mandala symbol, the symbol of deiform completeness, usually a circle containing a set of coordinates. This symbol was found to coincide in major characteristics with the mandalas and ancient and modern religions, myth, etc. And in the case of the individual patient, this particular revelation of divinity in one's own potential self is usually accompanied by a feeling of profound inner peace. Kane's insightful comparison between Hegel's idea of unhappy consciousness and Kant's critique of practical reason allow us to see Hegel was very much influenced by Kant, although fundamentally disagreed with Kant's positing of two worlds in order to reconcile virtue and happiness. Individual consciousness, the mediator, the unchangeable, are all constructions within self-consciousness, and when these are divided into different realms, it creates a problem that need not be created in the first place. Secondly, Keynes' reference to Kierkegaard allows us to draw connections to Nietzsche's philosophy of the death of God, which I think also puts Hegel's notion of unhappy consciousness into perspective and confronts us with the question, do we really want to believe in God and a God at all? Or in a higher mediating value at all is where I would end it. The unhappy consciousness, though, is in many ways for Hegel the key to freedom, and the question is why? Why is something that involves so much servitude actually becoming its opposite and making one be free? And that is a question that's going to come up as we discuss these kinds of concepts in Marxist literature in the future. Hope you found this interesting and useful. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. Have a great day.